Ortega set a course for the system, son.
What is Starfleet is the most important episode Strange New Worlds has given us so far. There's 3 reasons for that: the format, the context, and the message. First, the format. Unlike any other Star Trek episode in a canon of nearly 1,000 episodes of television, What is Starfleet presented us with a documentary. The documentarist is Batu, Erica's brother, and by this point he's been in the ship for a while. We've seen him around interacting with the crew, forming relationships with them, including a romantic relationship with Uhura, and following people around with his cameras. In this episode, we get to see the product of his work. This is a Strange New Worlds taking advantage of the episodic format in a very unique way, and taking it further, exploring its possibilities to the fullest, pushing it forward, at least where Star Trek is concerned. It's not the first time Strange New Worlds has played with genre in this way. There have been several episodes that have many horror elements in them, and only last season we had a musical episode. I think this is a big deal, because ever since the emergence of the Netflix model of television, people seem to have declared the episodic format of TV obsolete. Outside of Star Trek and a few very well-established procedural shows, no one really does it anymore. But here is a Strange New Worlds, reminding us that this format, the episodic format, offers a kind of freedom to play around with genre that season-length movies simply don't have. And now that people seem to finally be getting tired of having to wait 2 to 3 years to get a handful of episodes in a season that still feels incomplete, is the perfect time for that message. Beyond the novelty of an exotic way to tell this story though, this particular choice worked wonderfully because it allowed us to see a completely different side to these characters. The camera was right up in their faces and they were uncomfortable and vulnerable, restraining themselves, insecure, afraid, questioning their own thoughts, struggling to find the right words. We don't often get to see this side of these characters. It was much more intimate, much more vulnerable, and it brought us so much closer to them. Then there's the context, that is, what this episode brought to Star Trek and where it sits in the Star Trek canon. Batu's documentary starts with a question. What separates the Federation from an empire? Are they explorers, as they claim, or soldiers, as they appear? This is a major issue within the Star Trek fandom. Not so much the discussion of whether or not the Federation is an empire, perhaps, but certainly the question of whether or not Starfleet is a military organization. Personally, I stand firmly in the camp that says no. Starfleet is an organization that uses some of the pillars and trappings of the military, such as hierarchy and discipline, whilst maintaining their non-military character. And this episode landed a powerful argument in support of that. Batu Ortegas is documenting a difficult mission. The Enterprise was ordered to assist the Lutani by escorting a sort of spacefaring livestock towards their home world. The creature is supposed to assist in their rebuilding efforts in some way, since they are at war. But the Enterprise will be going into an active war zone. Everything about the mission, the reason behind their orders, is classified. Even information about the creature, the Jikaru, is secret. This is an aspect of Starfleet we rarely get to see. Usually we're like the ship's computer. We are everywhere, we know everything, we have maximum security clearance. We know everything that the captain knows at the very least. It is unusual that we see the captain in a position where he has to withhold information from the bridge crew. It happened before. It happened in the Omega Directive on Voyager, and earlier than that in Chain of Command in The Next Generation. But it's not common. This episode did it brilliantly. Halfway through the episode, the crew discovers something unexpected about the Jikaru. Something that changes the story completely and cranks the tension 1,000-fold. All the while this is happening, the crew is being pressured by the documentarist to explain why Starfleet is dragging this creature into an active war zone. The answers the crew gives to Batu's questions are imperfect. We could certainly scrutinize Lan's answer, for instance, when she talks about how some things are necessary for the greater good. We know the dangers of that kind of phrasing, that kind of thinking. But those imperfections made it emotional and raw and real. I have certainly been in that position before. The position of being asked things I had never been asked before, and wanting to engage in the conversation and give answers that I haven't had a lot of time to think about. Express thoughts that may be incomplete, with words that may not not have been the best words to explain what was in my mind or in my heart at that time, thoughts that might evolve and change with time. Letting us see these characters experiencing that was amazing. Additionally, as if there wasn't already so much going on in this story, there were tidbits of information about the characters sprinkled throughout the episodes. Things that made these characters deeper and let us get to know them a little bit better. For Uhura, that was a name that became infused with grief. For Spock was a story that perhaps isn't so painful anymore. For Pike it was a memory. And when the story was over and done, when all the words had been spoken and when there was nothing else, what is Starfleet still had a message. This is a Star Trek thing. The original series often had a message, but it's not always so clear. You know, Star Trek has brought me many good things, from the wonderful people I met because of the show, to the way the characters have kept me company all the times when I was all alone. But one of the good things it brought me, one of the things I learned, was an appreciation for how difficult it is to understand a time that was different from our own. When I first watched the original series, I thought that Uhura wearing such a short skirt was a sexist thing. Of course, the skirts were so short, I thought, it's just how life is. Women are expected to look amazing and show a lot of skin to be on television. I encountered this sort of thinking online as well, and it seemed to make sense. And it wasn't a big deal. I was able to shrug it off, credit to the show being a product of its time, and leave it at that. I didn't think too much about it. Since then, I have met other Star Trek fans, including people older than myself, women older than me. And what they told me is that at the time, Uhura's miniskirt was seen as a feminist statement. It was a show of strength and agency, the decision to wear whatever she wanted, no matter how provocative it might be, and still be taken seriously in her professional world. To me, learning this was a revelation, not because I cared deeply about the size of people's skirts in the original series, but because it opened my eyes to how easy it is to misinterpret the past. Ever since new Star Trek shows started coming out again, Star Trek has been sucked into the political conversation as almost everything else has. And suddenly, there were people criticizing Star Trek for being too left-wing, and people saying Star Trek had always been left-wing, and neither of those statements seemed entirely fair to me, but I couldn't figure out why. Now I think at least part of the reason is that people don't realize how easy it is to misinterpret the past. Take Chekov, for instance. Everybody talks about how forward-thinking, how avant-garde it was to have a Russian on board the bridge in the middle of the Cold War. And it was. And I think in many ways, having a Russian as part of the main crew now would be as forward-thinking as it was to have Chekov on the bridge all the way back in the 60s. Or a Middle Eastern officer for that matter. And listen, I could be wrong here. I am not the arbiter of what is the right way to interpret Star Trek, nor am I trying to be. I am just a girl who happens to love a show that was made many decades before I was born, in a place I have never visited, by people I will never have a chance to meet. But I don't think Chekov's presence on the bridge was an endorsement of communist Russia. And I don't think they were trying to hammer into the minds of people in the 60s that they should treat Russians as brothers. I think Star Trek was merely reminding them that they could. Reminding them that the war would be over one day, and when it was, there would be choices to be made, and this was one of the possible choices. This is a critical difference. Which brings us back to Strange New Worlds. Because the thesis of Betty's documentary is an investigation of whether or not Starfleet's actions are anything more than a 23rd century form of colonialism. And having that character asking those questions in that way is so in sync with our times, because there are so many people like that today. People who see the world through a narrow lens and reduce everything to colonialism or nationalism, racism, Marxism, sexism, or the fall of Western civilization. We are bombarded from every direction by the judgments of people who think they can gauge our character in a second and neatly place it in a single word shelf. But it is possible to remember your own heart, even when someone is yelling loudly that it isn't there. That's what I took from this episode. Because when Beto accused Starfleet of being colonialist, Uhura's response was illuminating. When they spoke in sickbay, after the heat of the moment had passed, Beto insisted that he was just asking questions, but Uhura saw through him. I believe you think that's what you were trying to do, she said, but you came here angry. You had a point to prove. Uhura's response was kind and level-hearted, not because the onus of emotional control was on her, but because she chose to behave that way. And that's all any of us can control, really. Our choices, our own behavior, our words and our actions. To me, that was an important message. Not because Star Trek is trying to dictate the book of how to live a virtuous life, but because it's presenting me with a path. Putting the characters under pressures that are comparable to the pressures we face ourselves, and letting them respond to those pressures in a way that feel realistic and in character. This is good storytelling. And in the case of this specific story, Uhura is presenting us with a path, with a way to deal with this kind of situation, and it's a way that I hope to be able to follow. These are my thoughts on what Starfleet is. I think it was a wonderful episode. I'm enjoying Strange New Worlds more than I can say. You know, there's no Star Trek I don't like. I had a lot of fun with Lower Decks. I've been inspired by Prodigy. I'm even learning to enjoy Discovery now that I'm watching the later seasons for the first time. But Strange New Worlds has finally made me fall in love with New Trek in a way that hadn't happened before, in a way that I wasn't sure was ever going to happen. And it's wonderful. Strange New Worlds now ranks as highly to me as the original series or Deep Space Nine or The Next Generation. And it's beautiful and intense and amazing, and I look forward to new episodes every week. It is awesome, and I'm sure I will suffer when it ends. But for now, it is still here, and I am very much looking forward to the episode that's coming out this week. Oh, and I wish we had gotten to hear Captain Pike playing the guitar in that one scene. This is it for now, crew. Live long and prosper. No, I had a chance to talk these ideas over with the guys from the Star Trek Society, so that was pretty nice. It was nice to have someone